In this video, we're going to address the GlobalState class.
Now, what is the GlobalState class, and why do we need it?
Well, in the creation of this game, we're going to have several pieces of information that are going to need to be accessible throughout the entire game.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, we'll actually build to this class as we continue. The idea with GlobalState is that we're going to make one known place that all the other classes can look to get global information. And that will include things like path information, meaning where do samples come from, where do songs come from. And it's also going to store specific instances of objects that a lot of different classes may need access to. This includes the current game instance as well as the currently instantiated sound engine.
Gotcha. So rather than scatter these fields across different classes, we're going to have all of the global stuff contained in this one location.
Exactly.
Cool.
All right, let's get started. Let's jump over here to our project. I'm going to collapse some of these folders to give us some more room. We'll pull references back down, and we'll begin here in the game folder. Right-click on Game. We'll add a new class, and we'll call the class GlobalState. We'll add this class in. We'll clean up our namespace, and we will set the class to be a static class. And in so doing, we'll simply indicate that we're not going to have any instance members whatsoever. Now, before we drop the fields that GlobalState is going to contain, we're going to add a couple of using statements, because some of the things we'll be storing in here will be part of the XNA framework.
Sure.
So we'll begin with a using for Microsoft.xna.framework and framework.graphics. Now, we may not fully utilize types out of both of these at this point in time, but again, we're going to be building on GlobalState, so we'll simply make sure we have these using statements out of the way ahead of time.
Okay.
Now, moving on to the fields that will be contained within GlobalState, we're going to start with a series of paths. Paths are going to be useful for things like loading of samples. We're actually going to store the content folder itself. Later we'll have to make sure that we point the content manager at this path. And we'll also store a reference to samples and to style. So all of these fields are going to be both public and static. Again, this is to give the global visibility to everyone who might look at the GlobalState class. So we'll have public, static, string for our first field, and this field is going to be called app path.
This is just where the location sits, or where the game sits on the hard drive.
Exactly. This will be the exact, absolute location of the game's executable. Or rather, the folder that contains the game's executable. All right, moving on from here. We'll have another public static field, and this will be, let's see, also a string, and this will be the content path. Now here, inside of the field initializers, we're going to store a relative path to each of these, and then in the game's constructor we'll assemble the absolute path. So basically we'll expand on these relative paths.
So that makes sense, because the content path will just be inside a content folder that's already inside the app path.
Exactly. So really, the only unique piece of information that would go in such a path is the fact that it's in the content subfolder. And then we'll simply resolve all of these later.
Right.
And that way here in the initialization, it simplifies things. Now I'll grab our content path field, and I'll just copy and duplicate it, and we'll change it the name to samples path. And the actual folder that will represent is simply samples. And we'll repeat the same thing one more time, and we'll call our last field style path. And we'll simply call the folder style.
Okay.
And you'll notice that some of this is lining up here over to our content subproject, where we have samples and we have style. And of course, content itself is going to be represented by the content subproject.
Right.
All right. There's a few more fields we want to store, and that is a reference to the current game instance. So we'll make another public static field, this time of type game, and we'll call this game instance.
Okay.
And one more will be a reference to the sound engine itself. So once again, public static, the type will be sound engine, and we'll call the field sound engine. And this is the place that any sound playing code later in our game will need to look, because we'll be
Gotcha.
addressing this instance of sound engine to facilitate the playback of sounds. Alright, at that point, that takes care of the GlobalState class itself.
So now we're on to the constructor.
And I will build briefly just to make sure we don't have any syntax errors. All we have here are warnings that some of these fields aren't being used yet. And now we can turn our attention to the game's constructor. So we'll jump down here in our project, bring up game 1, and down here inside of the constructor, there's some work we need to do with paths. First, we need to establish our application path, and we'll simply copy the location found in storage container.title location. So what we'll do is we'll say that globalstate.app path is equal to storage container.title location.
Mm-hmm.
Now we need to build the content path, and we'll use the path class itself and the combine method in order to put these together. Now, of course, at this point, we don't have system.io referenced. So to make these calls a bit shorter, we're going to jump up to the using statements.
Sure, add system.io.
Exactly.
Just like we did with the sound engine.
Yep, same deal here. System.io. And we'll add this as a using statement. Then back in our constructor, we can say that our content path, so we'll address globalstate.content path. We'll set that equal to
path.combine.
And we'll put together the combine. There we are. Put together app path as part 1, or rather globalstate.app path, and globalstate.style path. And of course, style path at the time of this call should be the relative path with...
Now, this is for the content path. Shouldn't that be the...
Oh, I got ahead of myself.
Yeah. No worries.
Let's step back up.
Yeah. Well, you could just leave that and just change your call there to content path. Yeah, right there.
I'll change it over and then store that back in content. So again,
Gotcha.
So same principle, different path. We've got the content path. So we simply have the relative, just folder content, that will get joined to title location, now held in app path, and all that will get stored back into content path. So the result will simply be to expand the relative content path to the absolute content path.
Makes sense.
All right, now we can continue with the final two paths, samples and styles. I'll copy content path, the whole line, duplicate it, and this time we'll address samples path. Samples path will actually start with content path as the root, because of course samples
is within content.
Reside within content. So we start here, global state.content path, and then we'll join global state.samples path. And then the last one will be our style path. So we'll take global state.style path. We'll join that to our content path. Global state.style path. So relative path join becomes expanded absolute.
Very nice.
And then one last thing we'll do is, since we are specifying the content path, since we need to know about it, but we'll also pass that on to our content subproject. Now I know right now they're both pointing at the same place, but it's probably a good idea to keep these looking at the same place. So that means the new place from which we set the content path is global state and this place alone.
Gotcha.
That means if we do change it, our content
update.
Exactly, our content manager will know to look at the real actual path.
Yeah.
Now we can build and make sure that there's no errors. Now before we finish everything off, I do want to make sure that all of the path expansion is working as expected. So I'm going to set a breakpoint up here at the first line in the constructor, and we'll run the game, and immediately we'll break out as we hit the constructor. So we can see that our app path is going from null, and then if we advance a line, app path becomes the full absolute location to the game. Now, currently, content path is just the relative folder content. However, once we join it to app path, the result will be the big long path ending in content.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing for samples path. Goes from samples to samples at the end of the whole path. Style goes to style at the end of the whole path.
Nice.
So now content path will get stored back into content, and all will work. So I'll break out of this and take away the breakpoint. And with that, really that has global state covered. Again, it's a very simple class.
Mm-hmm.
It is merely a way of storing all the various instances of information that we'll need. Speaking of instances, there is one more to address. Back in global state, of course, we're not going to be setting our sound engine yet because sound engine is going to be handled in conjunction with the config system, since sound engines will be configurable. But game instance, I don't think we're setting game instance yet. Over here in game,
no,
we're only working with paths. So let's jump up and do that before we even address all of the path stuff. Take global state dot game instance, and we'll simply set that equal to this reference inside of the game.
There you go. So
and I'll let
this instance of the game is being stored.
And what's interesting about that is that copies or makes a reference to an instance, but stored in a static field.
Yeah.
So now we don't have to worry about passing the game around to every class that might exist.
We can just reach up to that static right there.
Exactly, and get whatever the current game is.
Cool.
So we'll build, and we have no errors, only a warning about the fact that sound engine isn't used, but we know that it's not going to be until later. So really, that wraps up this video.
Okay, so we've created a global state system that all of our other classes can reach into for any sort of global information, and looks like we're ready to move on.